Well, good morning, good afternoon, all. Thanks again for joining FSMA Friday. This is March 2021. My name is Aaron Bolshaw, the moderator for FSMA Fridays, which, as you know by now, of course, is an ongoing monthly industry update for food and beverage facility operators, your QA folks, your safety and compliance professionals. We're honored to have a few FDA professionals on the line from time to time as well. So we team up with the SafetyChain team. Gets together with the Atchison Group to bring you guidance and thought leadership on a host of topics throughout the year revolving around the Food Safety Modernization Act. Today's presentation, we're covering some details on FSVP and specifically how to avoid that FDA Form 483'A, which no one really likes. And I think we're going to create a new verb today while we're at it, getting 483'd. So happy that you could join us. And before we get started and before I get some introductions on the line, we're going to take about a half hour today, go through some timely information. Everyone is on mute, but we do want to hear from you. So we expect you'll have a few questions, likely some specifics detailing maybe something in your food facility or your beverage operations. We'll stay flexible with our time. You know, the topic is expansive. We can stay on a little bit later, take a few more questions if we have those. So with that, I'd like to introduce today, we've got Dr. Lily Young, PhD, Food Safety Associate at the Atchison Group, and she's a specialist focused on the impacts of consumer and stakeholder attitudes, behavior, and the technological utilization within the food system. So we're real close friends now with Lily, of course, here at SafetyChain. And Chris Snabs is the Director of Food Safety at Atchison Group, 18 years plus, microbiology, biology, and again, one of a few authorized lead instructors for the vulnerability analysis component of the food defense plan. So again, a couple of perfect experts with us today. Welcome, Dr. Young and Chris. How are you guys doing?
We're doing great, Aaron. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, everybody, for being here.
All right. Well, I'm eager to share some things with y'all. We've got a lot of folks on the call listening for how to avoid getting 483'd, and I suppose now, you know what, we're going to add that to a list of new verbs, right? Getting 483'd. So before we get into that FSVP part, Chris, why don't you get us started just kind of covering what's new in FSMA?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. Well, it's hard to believe, but we are approaching the 10-year anniversary when FSMA went into effect. So it went into effect April 1st, 2011, and here we are 10 years later. It was signed into law by Congress and mandated that it's not enough to respond to outbreaks of foodborne illness. We must prevent them from happening in the first place. And that's the basis of FSMA. It's preventive. Prior to FSMA, the FDA, and many of us all were reactive to an issue. Now we flip that around and we're going to be as preventive as possible. And the rules are working. We've seen this in many instances of many facilities we go to. People are really doing a great job, and they're preventing hazards from getting into the food products every day. So kudos to those of you who are working in the food facilities, making this all happen properly. Another update is the VQIP application portal is now open for fiscal year 2022. So if you are one of the few entities that are currently doing, or if you're a new entity wanting to do it, your portal is now open and you can go ahead and apply for that. The latest update is regarding the traceability rule. The FDA added clarifying descriptions to the food traceability list. They've published a frequently asked questions on the food traceability proposed rules, so go ahead and check out their website. It had two updates that it presented for stakeholders regarding requirements for additional traceability records for certain foods. So they're starting to narrow it down and get more clarified for industry. So it's going to be a great help. And with that
was going to be happening. So we knew there was going to be a few adjustments to that list. So definitely check those out, especially if you have those particularly vulnerable foods, if you're on that list. So
very good. And with that, I give it to Lily to present today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Chris. And hi, everyone. It is great to virtually meet you all. Today, my name is Lily, and today we're going to talk about how to prevent a 483, specific to an FSVP, which is short for Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So why is this important? Well, we'll talk about this obviously in a bit in more detail, but before we begin, I want you to take a piece of pen and paper or just in your head or on your phone right now. Can anyone take a guess how many 483s from the FDA they think happened in 2020 specific to FSVP? Write down what you're thinking and we'll talk about this in a little bit. And before we start and continue on with this, I do want to give a big shout out to Chris. He was instrumental in ensuring that this presentation also came very well together because he is also a lead instructor for the FSVP. And so I want to say thank you for Chris for helping with this, and also Gat. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So, to begin, but first to frame the conversation, we have to address everything in the FSVP rule. So under FDA's FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, there was also a rule, obviously, for Foreign Supplier Verification Program, FSVP for short, for importers of food for humans and animals both. As we all know, but always worth a reminder, some of the biggest effectors for FSMA were to, 1, prevent food hazards, 2, address the safety of human and animal food throughout the supply chain from the start to end consumer, and 3, to provide the FDA with new tools and resources to better ensure food safety for U.S. consumers, regardless of where food is produced. And as part of that, and luckily enough, that's what an FSVP covers, especially for food that is not produced in the U.S. In fact, imported foods account for 19% of the U.S. food supply, including 52% of the fresh fruits and 22% of fresh vegetables that we eat. Wow. Thus, the purpose of the FSVP rule is to provide adequate assurances that foods produced for the U.S. market and importers of food are always expected to supply food that complies with U.S. food safety requirements. The rule sets requirements for importers to verify that U.S. food safety standards are being met, and also assign a critical role to the importer to ensure safe food by placing responsibility on the food importer to ensure the safety of the imported food itself. Because no one wants to have unsafe food nor make their ultimate end customer sick, right? So just like with U.S. produced foods, importers also must make sure that their suppliers of foods are not adulterated, not misbranded, especially with allergen labeling of human food, although not animal food, and also meets other requirements in which we'll discuss in the following slides. So, although the FDA has always emphasized the importance that all parties in the food production system have responsibility for ensuring and maintaining the safety of food products, the rule further requires that importers must have a program in place to verify that their own foreign suppliers are producing safe food just as defined through the use of preventive controls and or even the produce safety regulations. And just like the U.S. produced foods, importers also must make sure that their suppliers' foods are not adulterated, not misbranded, again, like we talked about before, and also continue to meet the requirements that we are discussing now. Additionally, the FSVP requirements are risk-based. According to the type of foods, as we know, some foods have higher risk than others. They're hazard-based, what hazards may or may not be present. This includes biological, chemical, radiological, even from the location of import. And how has the supplier previously performed? FSMA, though, luckily, provides flexibilities to how these requirements can be met that we won't really be discussing today, but we would be more than happy to discuss with you later on. So, what exactly is the FSVP? So the FSVP itself, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, right, it's a lot of words, doesn't actually have a set format. You have flexibility as to how to format your own FSVP. The rule is a set of requirements that must be met, which are specific to the circumstances of a particular food and or supplier. However, everything must be documented and records must be kept, like with pretty much all FDA-related aspects that we've discussed until this point. The cumulative collection of your records demonstrating how you implemented the FSVP requirements is your FSVP. So in a quick thought to this, for example, if you are importing 10 different yogurt flavors, all with the same hazards and specific procedures and by the same supplier, you only need one FSVP. However, if you're making 10 different items, each with its own unique hazards, then each one of these needs its own FSVP. It's important to remember that FSVP must be completed, though, before any food article enters the U.S. So who's actually impacted? Well, first of all, what is an importer exactly? An importer, as defined in 21 CFR, specifies the FSVP regulation is the owner or consignee of an article of food that is being offered for importation into the U.S. In this case, the U.S. owner or consignee is also defined by the FSVP rule as the person in the U.S. who, at the time of U.S. entry, either owns the food, has purchased the food, or has agreed in writing to purchase the food. So this person, the quote FSVP importer, must be defined in the entry filing. On the other hand, it is also possible that there may be no U.S. owner or consignee, in which case the importer becomes the quote U.S. agent or representative of the foreign owner or consignee at the time of entry. And this must be confirmed in a signed statement of consent to serve as the importer under this subpart. In this case, this agent or representative that is, defined can carry out the FSVP's responsibilities. However, again, we need to stress this. It must be agreed upon by both parties in writing before any food article is imported. Ultimately, all this to say, someone must take responsibility. Very frequently, more than one entity, this being an entity being an individual, a company, or other, can meet the FDA's definition of an importer, quote, quote, for FSVP purposes. Whoever is this, quote, importer, whether it's the U.S. owner or the representative who is based in the U.S., it must be someone in the U.S., though. If this does happen to be more than one individual who could be designated as the importer, again, like we have said, the communication and compliance amongst all parties is absolutely essential, because not only do you have to communicate amongst yourselves to determine who's doing what, but you also have to understand the foreign suppliers of the food being imported. So whomever or whatever is chosen or identified as the FSVP importer for a particular food or foreign supplier will then be responsible for carrying out all of the FSVP obligations. This is the person who must be an FSVP qualified individual, whom the FDA will contact for review of the program and for any issues that may arise. And we'll talk about who an FSVP qualified individual is next. So, like with preventive controls and other rules that we've seen in FSMA, with FSVP, there is also the need for a, quote, qualified individual. So food importers are required to do a number of things that can only be done by persons who meet this definition of, quote, qualified individual. As with preventive controls and other rules, an importer can use different qualified individuals to perform different tasks. For example, some qualified individuals might be better suited for one task versus another. For example, conducting a hazard analysis versus a verification activity. If you are in need of FSVP knowledge and certification, please let us know, since Chris, like we just mentioned, is an FSVP lead instructor, and we are more than willing to work with everyone to also help train you and also have these discussions. So does the FSVP requirement actually apply to me? Well, before we move on to this, you may be asking, well, Lily and Chris, I am importing food. Does this apply to all importers? Like, what is this looking like? So the FSVP regulation applies to all human and animal foods imported, including some foods that I'm eating right now, unless it's exempt. So some foods that you would consider as being requiring FSVP would be things like low-acid canned foods for microbiological concerns, infant formula, acidified foods, shell, eggs, and bottled drinking water all fall into this category. Additional exempted foods include any foods that fall under FDA HACCP rules, seafood or juice, certain alcoholic beverages and their ingredients, foods imported for research or evaluation, not for sale or for personal consumption, or transshipped to the U.S. without going into the food product to be sold in the U.S. So certain meat, poultry, egg products as defined by USDA regulated foods, returned U.S. foods that are coming back to the States. Or another category of exempted foods are those produced in countries under systems recognized with systems recognition of equivalency, those being Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Additionally, certain small importers, certain small producers, and dietary supplements all have, quote, modified requirements, which we can discuss in detail at another time. Otherwise, we go over time. So really quickly, let's run down the standard basic requirements of an FSVP, how it's developed, and what it constitutes. So with most things, first you need to conduct a FSMA-based hazard analysis of the food, including the hazard identification and hazard risk evaluation based on severity and likelihood. Here we go. Then, of course, you'd want to conduct an evaluation of the foreign supplier's food safety performance and risk posed by the food itself. So part of this would include, well, how has the supplier been doing? What have they been doing? How have they done in the past? Are there any dings or do they have any notices on them, such as an import alert that we should be aware of? And the thing is, you don't need to approve your supplier if based on your evaluation, you were like, hey, this supplier isn't meeting the standards that we have set. And to that, you can either seek to approve or disapprove your supplier based on the evaluation that you conducted. If you do move forward with approving your foreign supplier or a foreign supplier as an importer, you must also establish written procedures that ensure that the food imported is only imported from that approved supplier or suppliers. From there, you need to determine and apply appropriate verification activities. And if things go wrong, you'd also need to implement corrective actions as needed. To that end, the foreign supplier should always be reevaluated at the minimum every 3 years, but definitely when there is a reason to do so. For example, having an alert. Finally, on your end, as the importer, it is necessary to identify the FSVP importer at entry. So this could be either, again, you or a representative. And most importantly, records. Keeping your records and documentations for at least 2 years. Lastly, and perhaps even the most important of this, again, and you can never reiterate this enough, an FSVP must be completed before any food enters the U.S. So how does this impact you? So in 2020, the top 5 reasons for all categories of 483's issued were number 1, FSVP development, sanitation, number 2, number 3, hazard analysis, number 4, hygienic design, and number 5, supply chain control. But of course today, we're only talking about FSVP because as it turns out, there were 554 instances of who did not develop an FSVP that was 483. This is literally the number 1 category out there. So if anyone had guessed anything above 500, you were correct. And then now, I wonder how many people actually guessed that too.
I was way off. I guessed 275. I had no idea. That was just a guess.
So we're going to talk about the top 5 reasons 483s, companies were 483'd, now that we're making this into a verb, for FSVP non-compliance. As we have said, the first being you did not develop an FSVP, and that accounted for 485 human ones, and the 554 account for other ones, animal ones as well. In addition to that, document foreign supplier approval, not having that was 53. Not having a written hazard analysis, and additionally, not conducting a document evaluation. And finally, not having established written procedures to ensure appropriate verification activities were conducted. Phew. So we will also talk about other things that we saw in the report that also really popped out to us as leading to being 483. In the report, we also found a few other types of citations, and it is important to call out the information regarding the documentation provided by the potential foreign supplier under review. For one of them, we did see you do not maintain or follow an FSVP. Others did not provide an English translation of an FSVP record that is written in another language. So all documents must be either in English or a language that the FSVP QI reviewer is proficient in. And at the time of any FDA inspection, the FDA will expect documents to be in English for their review. If not, the FDA, as you see in this point, will provide the QA a, quote, reasonable amount of time for the documents to be translated to English. It is, by the way, it is best industry practice to have all your documents translated into English ahead of importation. Other citations that we saw were that the FSVP did not provide adequate assurance that foreign suppliers producing compliant food for public health. Again, we are here to ensure that everyone is producing food safely and the food imported meets the same kind of safety standards as those foods that are produced in the U.S. Not having signed and dated FSVPs accounted for a few different citations as well, and we all know how important within the FDA in the realm of food and documentation that we should have signed and dated documents. The FDA also, there was a citation also for not having a company not properly investigating and documenting an investigation for how adequate the foreign supplier was. And there were other citations in which the importer did not retain an FSVP. Perhaps they had it before and then must have tossed it. Additionally to that, and we will kind of accentuate this a little bit, is the fact that it is actually important for the FDA to be able to see your FSVP electronically, especially in the age that we are in which a lot of documentation can be done from afar. Finally, another citation that did show up dealt with the low-acid canned foods, in which the FSVP that was reviewed did not address all matters that are not controlled by low-acid canned food regulation. So these were other ones that we definitely also picked up on as well, on top of, most importantly, having or not having an FSVP. So looking ahead at 2021 and what this all means. So in previous years, the FDA focused heavily on promoting educating while regulating when it came to FSVPs. But since the fiscal year 2020, the FDA, we have seen, has transitioned to enforcement. So you may be asking us, so why has enforcement stepped up on the FSVP rule and not other aspects of FSMA, which were sidelined by the COVID-19 pandemic? The short and long answer is, well, the FSVP program is a pure document review that does not actually require the physical presence of an FDA investigator. If you receive a request from the FDA, either in an email or some type, for any part or all of your FSVP program, you are mandated to provide the information within 24 hours to the FDA investigator in charge. Hence, we're saying, like, you need to have all your documentation electronically available, which makes it much easier. And the FSDA investigator routinely will conduct these FSVP asks through a secure electronic portal of your choice or even through regular email. Additionally, the FDA now is initiating more, quote, for-cause FSVP inspections that are driven by instances of foodborne illness and or if other food safety issues are identified at the time of entry or even post-entry. To that, it is worth mentioning that the FDA had began conducting re-inspections in the fiscal year 2020. So, for example, if any observations previous to fiscal year 2020 were made in which, in a previous inspection, and there was a citation, the FDA expects that the importer by now would have taken corrective action and are conducting those re-inspections. So some of these sites have been and other sites will be re-inspected. And as we look ahead, the FDA has already begun reporting some of the citations that they have seen already in fiscal year 2021. And of this, still at the top of the list is really that the importer has not developed an FSVP. So that is, the big highlight that we are trying to get at today. So to that end, how do you avoid getting 483'd? Well, firstly, number one, we want to ensure you have properly trained and documented FSVP qualified individual. One note about training, we have had clients where the FDA requested this proof of training, such as providing a copy of their PCA FSVP qualified individual training certificate. Second, another way of avoiding getting 483 is making sure that you have an FSVP, of course, if you don't already have one, for each article of food you import from each supplier's location. So, for example, sometimes different suppliers will have more than one facility location. So you would need one from each different location. And one note about each article of foods imported, like we said earlier, similar foods having similar hazards can be grouped on one single FSVP. Like we talked about with the yogurt. Yogurt with different inclusions like strawberries and blueberries, they have similar hazards, they are similar foods, one FSVP is enough. But if you were to have two disparate foods with different similar hazards, each one, again, would need its own FSVP. If the supplier verification document is about to expire, such as with a GFSI audit you are dependent upon, ensure you reevaluate and date the FSVP appropriately. Another way of avoiding getting 483 is to ensure that you have a foreign supplier approval. Detail how you do it and what documents are acceptable. This might include SOPs. And finally, do your basic homework. And this we cannot stress enough, because you, being the liaison with the supplier, will also probably be asking these kind of questions, but we cannot stress this enough. Has the supplier been in any recall? Are they on any import alerts currently? Did they receive a 483 before or a warning letter? Or did they have a previously poor audit? And these itself might be red flags for you to consider. If the answer is yes to any of these, though, did the supplier appropriately perform a corrective action? So this itself can tell you a little bit more about how the supplier has done and reacted, and also feed into your evaluation. And if the supplier has not done anything, what is your proper corrective action for if anything were to happen? And one thing to avoid getting 483s that you had seen on the previous page, has the qualified individual signed and dated the FSVP. Again, documentation is important, and we need to see signatures, we need to see dates, and please keep your record. And another thing to consider is the hazard analysis complete? And if you need any extra help with that, please refer to Appendix 1, FDA's Appendix 1 on potential hazards for foods and processes, and it gives a really good breakdown of hazard analyses and what to consider. And finally, to avoid getting 483'd, and you saw previously on the slide, is, are your records in English? Did you retain them for 2 years after you discontinued using the foreign supplier food article? Has the FSVP expired? Keeping track and keeping on top of your records is absolutely important. One note we did want to make about exempted foods, that would have been under number 2, would be suppliers will still need to be on the FSVP documentation detailing why a food is exempt and or produced in an equivalent country with supporting documentation. So if you have low acid certification documentation or any of that stuff, that needs to be included as well. And as we mentioned before, if you and your company is in need of any FSVP training or certification, please let us know as well, as Chris himself is an FSVP lead instructor and can also answer questions. I would like to open this up, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This is fantastic, Lily. I'm shocked, that many people, the vast majority, just didn't have FSVP when they got 483'd, right? So interesting. I'm wondering if there's, we got a few hundred people on the phone. I wonder if any of these folks would fall under that category. Hopefully not. Hopefully not. So we do have a bunch of questions, though. We have a bunch of questions. So earlier on, we noticed we were having a little bit of problem, everyone, with the GoToWebinar platform. So many apologies if you were having a hard time getting in and hearing it. So, all right. David asked this. It's a good one. To clarify, food items shipped from Canada are exempt from the FSVP. Is that correct? And then I would add also, what about Mexico? So north of the border, south of the border, what's the call there?
I can answer that question. That's a great question. Although they are importing foods from Canada, which is a recognized country, and or Mexico, which is not, you still need to have an FSVP. For the Canadian example specifically, you have to tell us why that food is mutually recognized, and is it being produced safely according to the Canadian regulation that it falls under. Sometimes that can also be a local ordinance that says, yes, that facility reports to the local authority who says, yes, they're creating that food safely in accordance with the Canadian food laws. For Mexico, it's that country is not exempt. If you are importing exempted type foods from Mexico or any other country, you still have to tell me why it's exempt. So, for example, if you're importing juice that follows juice HACCP, you would say, I'm importing juice from Mexico. It's following juice HACCP, therefore it is exempt for the hazard analysis. And you have to then still fill out the remaining requirements of the FSVP. There's quite a few quote unquote boxes to check, as Lily was explaining. So, for example, even though they're filing with use HACCP, did they have any recalls? Did they get on the import alert list, or are they operating fine? So you still have to go through the FSVP process. Great question.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Great clarification. Thanks, Chris. Got another interesting question, a little bit nuanced here. So does food ingredients and additives manufacturers need to meet the FSVP for the raw materials they use to produce them? So a little bit of a different thing, because you're importing maybe not necessarily something, would that be covered though?
So that's another great question. So FSMA offers a flexibility for a manufacturer here in the United States. If you are importing, say, a raw ingredient that you are then going to use in production of food, you have the option of following your supply chain program, which goes through many of the same steps. And you don't have to have an FSVP program. At the time of entry, you just have to say you're the FSVP importer. If you're importing any product where you are doing no manipulation to it, it's already prepackaged, you only do, say, de minimis activities, say relabel it or take a large volume of prepackaged products and then sell them individually without physically touching or manipulating the product proper, then in that case, the FSVP route is the most likely route to go. In many instances, people who use the FSVP process are using it for finished goods. But there have been instances where people do import non-finished goods that they then sell to another entity, and that has to follow the FSVP process.
Got it. Okay, good. Thank you, sir. We don't, this next one, not a question. Really interesting story. Somebody wrote in, Ryan. Just wanted to share it. He said he's a fresh produce supplier, imports from Mexico. He said he went through FDA audit in 2020. Their main issue was it was needing more clarity in my supplier approval on how I was verifying information supplied and using that for final approval. What they wanted to see him sign all the pages reviewed, had clear criteria to show what led to approval, and doing a risk assessment by supplier, right? So while he had an FSVP and covered the top 5 that Lily went through, it wasn't quite what they wanted. So he had a chance to fix it. Ryan suspects they will be back. So I appreciate you giving that story, Ryan, on that. And then he goes on to say, oh yes, and now all documents are translated as a part of the approval.
Excellent. Right. Yeah, that's a great story. It's true. You should always have them translated. And what we usually recommend to our clients is have a separate standalone written SOP, which details what do you need from the supplier, what do you review, and what do you use to actually do the approval. And that's usually a separate document that goes in conjunction with the FSVP document, say if you were to put them in a tabulation type form where you fill in the boxes. So the standalone SOP is a great supporting piece of evidence that the FDA loves to see when they ask to review your FSVP or FSVPs. Yep,
good. All right, here's a question from John. He says, say I have done all of my hazard analysis and audited the facility and made sure they have a food safety plan that meets FSMA. They meet my needs. Do I need a form that states I have approved XYZ company? Isn't it somewhat obvious? Does he need a form? What does that look like?
So if he is doing an in-person audit, he has to detail, he has to write some kind of summary. He says, yes, I reviewed X facility, whatever it is, and X facility has met all the requirements for FSMA. He has to document that he's done that review, and what did he review it against? So he would say he reviewed it against the FSMA rules, either be human or animal or both, and he then has to sign and date that. So that piece of documentation has to be included. Another way to do that is if, say, the facility would provide a copy of their food safety plan, and he is reviewing that food safety plan, he can sign and date that which signifies, if he's the QI, that he's reviewed the food safety plan. So that is another supporting document where the FDA wants to see that date and signature on those documents that were reviewed. And that's evidence that you've done your due diligence.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you for that. I've got a good clarification question coming in from Diego. He asked, can you clarify the exemption for small importers? I remember we covered this once, Chris, but the question specifically is, knowing importers totaling under 2.5 million of annual sales are exempt, is it total sales, right? Or is it only sales for what the FSVP item goes into?
So that's a great question. It is total sales and amount of inventory in stock. So whatever that company produces, not just the item you're importing. So if let's say you're only importing one product from a company that makes 100 products, it's the total value of all products produced and in inventory. That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a very important clarification, because I wouldn't have known it also includes that stock.
Yep.
Because that would come into play certainly when you do when you go year over year, when you do that analysis and you do that a reconciliation. So good insight. All right, so are you able to just add in your supplier's hazard analysis, or do you have to do your own?
Well, the rule stipulates that the qualified individual has to be able to understand the hazard analysis. If the hazard analysis that is supplied meets all the requirements of a FSMA type hazard analysis, which, don't forget, includes radiological concerns and EMAs for a food safety issue, you can use that. What we always suggest is, if a supplier gives you a copy of their hazard analysis, to double check and make sure that the hazards that they call out, at a minimum, meet the hazards that's on that Appendix 1 that Lily referenced to earlier in the slide. I've worked with a client who called out their hazard analysis, and they still received a 483 because they didn't call out one of the hazards that the FDA expected them to call out that was listed on that appendix specifically. So it's a great way to double check to make sure that all the hazards are called out. And if you find that they skipped one, then that's reason to ask the supplier, okay, how are you controlling X hazard that you didn't identify?
Yep, that makes sense. Good. All right. We've got a couple more. I thank everyone for being attentive. We're over our time, but there's still a lot of great questions. So I'll ask a few more. There's so many, though, we're not going to get to all of them. We're going to try and get to you following this show. We're going to do our best to get follow-ups out. So interesting comment here. Is a review log sufficient, meaning, for electronic copies, or must a physically signed document, is that required?
You can electronically sign each document, and that is what is preferred based on, from what I've seen with past 483s that our clients have received. The FDA wants to see how you can prove you reviewed a document. Just listing them on a log, that leaves for wiggle room. And the FDA, you want to avoid any wiggle room. You want to be concise and accurate. So it is our recommendation that if you review a document, you sign and date that document. That's proof that you reviewed it. And again, electronic signature on top of the document is acceptable according to the FDA. All
right, good. Two more questions here. So this one's kind of a bit of a shell game. So this is an interesting one. This is I'm going to try and stump Chris with this one. Matthew asks, if product is imported and stored by a broker and then sold to a manufacturer in the US, which of these entities owns FSVP?
Well, in that case, that's a great question. In that case, both can become the FSVP. They have to sit down and decide which of us is going to handle FSVP paperwork. And that should be done in a written agreement ahead of time, again, before any food article is imported into the United States. a great clarifying question. It's actually pretty common in the industry is who's taking care of the FSVP. The last thing you want to have happen is the FDA come knocking on your door and you say, well, I thought the other guy had it. And the other guy says, well, I thought you had it because you weren't communicating. So good communication amongst those people need to be done in advance.
Well, and maybe one step further, those are terms possibly that can be used for negotiation as well, right? So that's a really good point. Thanks for asking that, Matthew. Well, last question. So, and this is PCQI related, so I thought you'd appreciate this one, Chris. So is it acceptable for PCQI to review and approve suppliers under FSVP?
If the PCQI can show and through documentation that they have reviewed the requirements to be a QI under the FSVP rules, then they could. But again, it has to be documented. We always suggest FSPCA type training, but that's not required to be a QI. If you have years of experience and you understand hazard analysis, or you received a degree in a related topic that deals specifically with that, if you can document that and show that, that can be used as evidence that you are the QI. So there's more than one way to be a QI under the FSVP rule. But just because you're a quote-unquote PCQI for human food or animal food, it does not automatically make you equivalent as a QI under FSVP. There are nuances under the rule that you need to be aware of.
Okay. Good. And just because we're talking about the qualified individual, one last question. Richard asks, where can we get training for QI?
Well, you can always contact TAG. Another place to look at a list of who some QIs are is by looking at the FSPCA, the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance website, and they have a list of qualified individuals and as well as upcoming dates. And I'm sure any of those entities would be happy to train you. But again, feel free to contact TAG, and we can always talk to you separately.
Definitely, and that brings us to, there's a lot of TAG. You guys do a wonderful job. If you don't have their newsletter, please go get it. It is absolutely chock full of the best and latest news. We also have SafetyChain. We have the full FSMA Friday recording and sessions in the content library. You can go to safetychain.com to find those, and a lot of great stuff on our blog as well. And then upcoming FSMA Friday for April is a return to normalcy in sight. So we're going to kind of cover some stuff with Ben Miller about it's kind of a roundup of ways manufacturing has changed since COVID-19. We will also throw some things in there about what's going on with some new vaccine efficacies and availability. So don't miss it. Mark your calendars. And that brings us to the end. Dr. Young and Chris, I appreciate this. You guys, as always, show up. You do such a great job, and I appreciate the time you're giving us and all that you do for FSMA Fridays.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks again for joining us, FSMA Fridays. We'll see you next time, guys. Cheers.
Bye.